You're listening to Dropping Pins, a story-based learning series from the Okayest Hunter podcast, hosted by Derek Melkor, and aimed at helping you hone your whitetail hunting skills. You'll hear the aha moments when known and unknown proven whitetail killers started consistently putting mature bucks on the ground.
All right. Good evening, everybody. This is Derek from the Dropping Pins podcast, part of the Okayest Hunter podcast network. If you haven't checked out the other podcasts in the network, I highly, highly recommend it. If you're a podcast connoisseur, Eric has done a great job assembling just a great group of people who are passionate about what they do. The Okayest Cooks, the Boyer podcast, Matt Morris is doing an awesome job if you're interested in building self bows. Western Territory, oh my God, Southern U, there's a million on there. Go check them out. For me, I have not recorded in over 2.5 weeks, even though you guys are getting a heavy dose every week. I haven't recorded in a while, so I'm trying to brush the rust off here and get back into the swing of things. But I think our guest is going to help me do that tonight. It's a gentleman that I've been following through social media and YouTube for quite a while. And does a style of hunting, not all the time, but definitely is very highly skilled in this style of hunting, which is tracking, which is a style that I've just really envied and tried to learn a lot from, even though here in Wisconsin, I have not taken the opportunity to do it as much as maybe I should. But this gentleman has an awesome YouTube channel called Tracking 200, where he's documented a couple seasons worth of hunting. And he's got lots of great episodes. You can definitely learn a lot from watching those. I highly recommend them. Not only are they informative, but they're entertaining, and he does a great job telling stories. He also is a registered guide in the Northeast, so he definitely knows his stuff. He was just recently attending Huntstock, which is really big up in New England, a hunting festival. They get together, and I believe he just put on a seminar and debuted part of his new hunting film, The Perfect Tracking Day. Sorry. Jeff Doyle, welcome to Dropping Pins. Thanks for joining us tonight. How you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me on, Derek.
Yeah, man, it's really good to get you on here. And I know you just came off a really busy week or weekend, or I'm not sure how long Huntstock goes, but I saw some pictures floating around, and you were giving seminars and you had the booth. So I know you were telling stories for the whole week probably. And now I'm on here going, hey, tell us some more stories, Jeff. So.
Oh yeah. Huntstock was a bunch of fun. If anybody's in the Northeast or getting out this way, it's a great event. Get to see a lot of, great content, meet people who are all over social media and people that aren't as well. So it was good. We had to talk to a lot of people over 3 days. It was great.
Yeah. I think it's relatively new, but it seems like it's really taken on and grown a lot in the last couple of years here. And I know like sponsorships and the number of people and the people they have coming in and doing talks they draw an awesome crowd of people. So it seems like a great thing that's going on for hunters in the Northeast.
Yeah, it seems, and people have said this is like a big deer camp, right? You're bumping into all these people who you definitely do not want to see in the woods because most of them are great hunters. And if you're bumping into them and they're in your spot, you're in trouble. So it's a great time to just meet people and be friendly, right? With them.
You'd rather bump into them in August than November.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's great. Now, Jeff, you and I were talking a little bit before the show. You were born and grew up in New York, then lived in New Hampshire, and now live in Massachusetts. One of the first questions I ask all the guests is just kind of to explain to our listeners so they have a good idea of where some of these stories are coming from. Living in those 3 different areas of New England, what kind of stuff did you kind of grow up? What kind of terrain did you grow up hunting? What's your kind of bread and butter? What are you most familiar with? Or what do you hunt now,
Yeah, so appreciate you having me on. Getting to talk about dropping pins is an excellent subject, right? I know you've asked me to line up a few stories in terms of what has clicked for me, and I've seen some of your other episodes. And my start to hunting was in Central New York, and we were in called the foothills of the Adirondacks. So you had some ag land, but also quite a few hills, and you weren't far from the mountains. And if you went south, you were into open fields. So I started squirrel hunting at a pretty early age and killed a lot of squirrels. that's how I think actually it was with a Ruger, 1022, and I think that's why I kind of continue to use a scoped rifle today, which is kind of bucking the trend from what a lot of people use in terms of like open peep and pump guns when they're out tracking.
Yeah, the tracking sort of, it's kind of funny you mentioned I mean, I think a lot of people get their start with small game and squirrels in particular, but just today we were sitting in the backyard and my son said, Dad, when am I going to get to kill my first squirrel? And do I have to eat it? And I was like, well, buddy, you shoot it. We got to eat it. Yeah. So that maybe that pushed it off another year. I'm not sure.
I ate him a few times, and then we had some old ladies that lived across the street from us, and apparently the one of them liked squirrel, and she said it was the only thing she could taste. So I had a good deal going. I could go hunt squirrel, and I didn't have to eat them. I could give her the loins and the legs,
And she thought you were just the nicest neighborhood boy there could be.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
So in terms of the terrain, New York State is divided into a northern hunting zone and a southern hunting zone. And the southern zone, you usually would be able to throw a doe tag. It used to be shotgun only. Now there's some places where you can use rifle, but the northern tier is the rifle. And then as you go up further, you get into the mountains. And my dad was into hunting, right? He got me into some action down in the southern tier of New York, where you had higher deer populations and some farmland. Mm-hmm. And so I harvested, some does and button bucks and a couple of kind of basket rack bucks down there. But then when I was 16, I shot my first buck in the Adirondacks. And at that point I was pretty much hooked, right? And even though when I moved eventually to New Hampshire and now Massachusetts, I am in a relatively suburban area, I choose to continue to go and hunt the mountains and the more mountainous areas, even some of the what you'd call like the high peaks, the White Mountains, the Presidentials, right, where you could spend all day long on a mountain. And this would more probably equate to folks that are out west. Our mountains are a good sized one is maybe 2,200 feet. A really big one is up 4,000, 5,000 feet, but you get up too high and there's no deer up there, right? So we're talking mostly about ones. I like the kind of 22 to 3,000 foot range. 3,000 foot's getting up there even, but that gives you an idea.
Is that what you notice is kind of the upper end of like the whitetails range in those type of places, 3,000-ish feet?
Yeah, I guess I don't know where there's a definitive line, but I know what I'm capable of hiking in a day. And you can go.
That's a pretty good line to know.
Yeah. So that gives you a sense. And in terms of the woods in the Northeast, because I know some of the folks that might be tuning in are maybe from the Midwest. We have in the Adirondacks and the White Mountains, there's a lot of forest that hasn't been logged in a long time. Some of it's never been touched in the Adirondacks, right? And with that, you've got very mature growth. You've got big, just big trees, and you don't have a lot of understory, so you can see for a long ways. In some cases, you could see a good 150, 200 yards, through the woods. You can pick things out. And then over in New Hampshire and Maine, and even Massachusetts, you've got a lot more denser woods. And that's just something to kind of help people visualize. We've got snow on the ground for tracking. You can see a long ways. Those deer can see you coming from a long ways too, right? Whereas in New England, it seems to be a lot closer quarters is what I've noticed.
Is that mainly due to more logging activity or more conifer, or where do you think that denser forest comes from?
So I think it does come from, the logging will have an impact, of course, but then where you're at in terms of climate zones, you'll get different plants. Like in the Adirondacks, you've got a lot of witch hobble, kind of this plant that grows. It's only, between probably 2 to 7, 8 feet tall, right? In New Hampshire, southern New Hampshire, Massachusetts, you've got mountain laurel, which is just this thick, nasty kind of stuff that's all weaving in, really gnarly, right? They can pop up. But then as you go further north, then you've got, these jack pine that can just get stacked together really, really tight. So you can, it's not one particular flora, I guess, that's kind of dictating the visibility. But it does seem to change a little bit where you're at, and you get onto these big beech or oak ridges, and you can see forever. But I guess I found that those are kind of dead zones, right? So
that's the type of terrain. Yeah, I mean, you've heard, I'm sure most of our listeners have probably heard like the 90-10 rule, where 90% of the animals are living in 10% of the area or the forest. And when I think of those, I mean, we've had areas like that in northeastern Wisconsin that hadn't been logged in, 70, 80, 90 years. And you can drive through there at pretty much any time of the year, winter when there's snow, and there's just never tracks of any really animals because there's just no vegetation growing low. You can see forever, and there's just not a lot for the deer there. So, I mean, that's what I think of when I think of like the void woods, where there's just, you got to find the pockets, right? We got to find that vegetation, whether it is mountain laurel or the witch hobble, like you're mentioning. You got to find those pockets where these deer are. And I think one of the coolest things that I was excited to get you on, as we mentioned before, is you do great with some still hunting tactics. I know you use some trail cameras I've seen in some of your videos, but you do a lot of tracking of deer, which I think is just so cool. It's something I've followed for a long time. I was lucky enough to spend 5 of my summers in the Adirondacks working at a summer camp near Lake George. I never got to hunt up there, but I've been in the area a little bit and was always intrigued by it. And getting someone who's literally followed where mature bucks walk multiple times, I just felt like, man, for this dropping pin series of learning what these deer are doing instead of just making guesses, that's a lot of time what we're doing in the Midwest here, whether it's woodlots or thick stuff, a lot of the areas I'm hunting on public, you can barely see 30 yards, that's the stuff I'm looking for. So you're making these guesses at what you think they're going to do. Then you either get it right or 90% of the time, 95, you get it wrong. And how could that be? You never know quite why. Did they see it? Did they smell you? Were they just not there? But that aha moment is a little bit more definitive when you do have an encounter, because you can gauge what happened. Whereas coming from a tracker's perspective, you're on these deer all the time. So I'm kind of curious as to what are some things that maybe you picked up through your years, or a story we kind of talked about it before, what is something that maybe you've learned, and maybe it wasn't necessarily a lights on aha moment, but what kind of thing would you say was one of those experiences that kind of changed how you thought about what these bucks are doing, or how they're using terrain, or they just kind of changed your mentality a little bit, maybe it gave you a little bit of an edge? Did you have something like that you'd be willing to share with us?
I can say that when I was in New York, my father had hunted there for years, so I had the luxury of being able to go to the spots that were kind of handed down to me, and that was a place that I started my skills in terms of a tracker. But once I got to New Hampshire, that's where I moved to, it was just I could hunt any place, and we didn't have Onyx back then, and I use Onyx all the time now. We had Google, and you could go and you could find these big green areas, that were parks and hunt areas. And I knew very little. We didn't have social media. If somebody could have told me, oh, you can actually hunt any land in New Hampshire as long as it's not posted, that would have been really helpful to know right off the bat, right? So I spent a lot of time initially trying to bow hunt, and I just got a new bow before I moved out, and I spent a lot of time just sitting in a tree, oh man. And I wasn't being productive, and I wasn't out there learning by sitting in a tree. It was kind of I would take a guess, I would go, and I'd be there for a few days, and I might see a few deer, but maybe they're off this way. And so eventually I said, you know what? I just have to go back to what I know, which is tracking, and get out there and walk around. And I was moving around with the bow as well. I finally killed a big buck with the bow. That was one that was on film. It was a very lucky one to capture on film. I feel like I've been very lucky all the time, whether it's shooting a big one or shooting one on film. I always feel lucky. I'll talk more about that maybe as we go on. But eventually, I needed to figure out how to get my own spots, how to learn where I could go, right? And that just took a lot of going to check this place and this place and this place. And I was driving a long ways, driving all the way up to northern New Hampshire, right?
At that point, are you still, I mean, you're at the phase where you're just looking at those larger blocks of public that were like, on paper maps or on Google, or like,
Yeah,
did you have any sort of mapping or plat
this,
books at that point, or are you just going to these big blocks and, hey, let's take a look?
yeah, I bought a gazetteer, and I was starting to get connected with a few people, and I had heard that Pittsburgh, New Hampshire was the place to go. There was, the big paper lands you didn't have to pay to go on to. People were killing big bucks. So I started driving like 4 hours to get there. And I'd get up early, I'd drive all day. Maybe I'd spend the night up there or drive back, later that night. My wife went up with me a few times, rented a cabin. And the thing that finally clicked, and maybe this is what I'm trying to get to, is that I eventually decided, boy, I'm driving past all this great hunting area, right? I'm looking left and looking right, and I'm seeing mountains, and I realize there's a big buck worth having a hunt over on all those mountains. Everyone has a buck that's worth having a hunt over. And it doesn't really matter where you go. If you want to kill the biggest buck in the woods, I would say yes, it matters where you go, right? But if you just want to go have a great day tracking, just go to where the snow is. And then you should have a number of mountains there that you can hop onto. And then you just got to go find that track. And that really opened things up for me. Eventually it became a more proficient tracker. I wouldn't still consider myself an expert tracker. I think always you've got a learning mindset, right? I got a learning mindset, always opportunity to learn. But yeah, that kind of like just kind of free my mind and say, I don't have to go up here. I can go to wherever the snow is, just chase the snow and then go be successful there.
That's a something that can be applied to anyone. It's like when you're driving past deer to find other deer that it's an interesting concept, and we've all heard of these promised land spots, or where this is a little bit better, or maybe and I'm sure like timber company land, we have timber company land here in Wisconsin, large tracts that get logged. Like I'm sure that does hold more deer, potentially better deer. But like you said, there's going to be deer. There's going to be good deer in lots of different pockets. And if you take the time to learn those pockets, I see exactly what you're saying, man. We've got pretty good sized chunks of national forest in northeast Wisconsin. I was just talking with a buddy. I mentioned to you before we started recording. I went down to Illinois this past weekend with a couple buddies scouting for our public land bow hunt this fall. And while we're driving down there, a couple hours to kill, talking with a good buddy of mine, and he says, hey, a coworker of mine has a cabin up close to where your parents' cabin is, where we do a lot of hunting on the national forest. I said, oh, really? Does he do any hunting? He goes, yeah, he's got 40 acres that he hunts on. I said, oh, does he go on any of the public up there? And he says, no, he said there's no deer on the public up there. And I just kind of chuckled, and I said, well, what'd you tell him? Because my buddy knows that we all hunt the public up there. We've killed some pretty nice deer. And he's like, oh, I didn't say anything. Well, I told him he should maybe go take a look if he doesn't have anything good on camera. But it's the same idea of like, well, they're not there. Like you get that block in your head of like, I have to go here, or they're not there. And you really pigeonhole yourself. And I think as hunters, we do that a lot, not just with land, with tactics, with like, we tend to really pigeonhole ourselves a bit more than we should. And I think that probably happens in your neck of the woods with guys who are trackers when you don't get snow. Like,
oh yeah,
what do you do if you're a tracker and you don't have snow? Like you kind of pigeonhole yourself there unless you have, another tactic that's going to work for you.
So many guys have been intrigued by my use of the grunt call and the rattling. I killed, I think it was 2021. I killed a real nice buck by rattling him in the big woods. I had to had something going in the morning, so I don't remember what it was. Maybe I was coaching soccer or something like that. And so I drove up. By the time I got up there, it was probably like 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock. I started to make my way through the woods, and it was kind of one of these like dry days. I ended up seeing a bear, and then I was cutting across this old logging cut, and I ended up, I'll keep it a short story, but I ended up looking down and seeing a tree.
Oh, the more detail, the better, man. The more detail, the better. Give it to us all.
Yeah. So I'm sneaking on this. It's one of the skid roads, but it's more open than it is like a selective logging. They pretty much clear cut it. And I look down, and I just see this tree going like this. It's the only tree. So I pull the scope up, and I'm kind of going down the tree like this. until I get down. And all of a sudden, I can just see a deer's head and antlers, and he's just rubbing that tree, right?
Oh, that's cool.
So there was a big rock next to me, and I hopped up on that big rock to try to get a better view because the grass and everything had grown up that even though I had been able with the scope to find that little slice, I couldn't see anything when I just looked at my eyes. I got up there.
How old of a clear cut is this? The tree's like 20 foot?
Oh, there's some of the raspberry bushes and everything are just towering over you. So it might be about 7 or 8 years old, maybe 10 years old, something like that. Yeah. So it's grown up. A lot of stuff has grown up. And so I hopped up on that there's these big boulders. They're not like rocks or giant boulders. I climbed up on that and I got up there and grunt called and everything. And nothing, just like vanished. Like it never even existed. Right. I waited up
no
there.
No movement, still as could be.
Yeah. I went down. I couldn't even find that tree. All right. It was like I had made this up in my head. Right.
I've been there before.
I couldn't find the tree or anything. So I was just like, oh, that was kind of wild. And I made my way up into this saddle. And so you've got this big clear cut on what would be like the east side of this two mountains that come together. And then on the west side, it just goes down. It's huge open hardwoods, and there's beech and some oak in there. And I got up into this corner, this saddle, which is right at the top of that clear cut, and rattled. And I think I read a video on this, very popular video. A lot of people have seen it based on the number of views. And like 17 minutes in, all of a sudden, here comes a buck. And I read someplace that you need to wait 20 minutes after you rattle. So I don't like sitting at all. I hate sitting. Okay. So I have to pull my watch out and time myself for 20 minutes or else I'll be leaving early. And sure enough, here he comes. And that was on dry ground. And that night it was supposed to snow. I knew this. And that buck came up and he got like about 25 yards from me. And I looked at him and looked at him and looked at him. And I wasn't going to shoot him because it was supposed to snow and it was the first weekend of the season. And
you were just about to get.
And it's, if you can see, it's this buck right here. And it's a big racked buck. I'd have been crazy.
Yeah, it's nice.
Eventually I pulled the trigger on him. So many people are intrigued with that because they hadn't ever rattled before, or they rattled, they never had anything come. And sure, in the big woods, I rattle quite a few times. If I'm on dry ground, I try to employ every single tactic I can, right? Whether it's using the grunt call or rattling or still hunting or sitting at the right time. So to be able to, for me, be successful, I got to make the most of that day when I'm out there. And I'm not always going to have snow. So.
Yeah. Wow. That's a cool story. I'm just curious, how far from where you saw like that, him making that rub, where you like kind of located that buck. So when you looped around to the top side of that saddle, about how far away would you say from where you initially saw him making that rub to where you shot him? How, like, what kind of distance are we thinking of here?
So I actually don't think it was the same buck because when the buck I shot came in, I saw him coming off one of those. It was off of this knob. Actually, he came down off it
from up above.
Yeah. So I mean, he could have gone out and come back. That's possible, but I think likely it was a different buck. Yeah.
And I mean, rattling is, man, I'm sure it's a little bit like the Northeast, how it is here in Wisconsin, where like, if you rattle, you're pretty much just scaring them to your neighbor most of the time. Like the stigma is like, it's not going to work. Like it's not going to work. The deer have heard it before, but man, you get in the right situation, you get a buck in the right mindset, and it really can work. Your story is kind of a little bit of the opposite of something that happened to me maybe about 5 years ago. I was hunting some public land in Illinois, and I got a buddy. He's the one who kind of talked me into hunting Illinois. He's like, man, the deer down here, they come to calls. Like, rattle, something's going to come. High deer populations, they're used to hearing it. Like, they're going to come. It's different than up in Wisconsin. So don't be afraid to hit your rattle on the antlers. Well, I did some like mid-morning scouting, hunted in the morning, and then I was still hunting along with my bow. And I found this little pocket of brush down low below these big oak hills. It was kind of along this river. It was in an oxbow. It was just real low, scrubby, crappy stuff. And I was caught my interest, and I still hunted down along the edge of it, right along the creek, and I saw like 3 rubs as soon as I got down there that looked fresh, and I was like, holy crap, like something's in here. So I set up and I hit my rattling antlers, grabbed my bow, 2 minutes in, I'm doing exactly what you said. I'm like, oh, this is never going to work. Like I should just get up and walk, right? I waited like 2 minutes, but I sat a little longer, and all of a sudden I thought I heard something, and 40 yards in front of me, I see a tree just start ripping back and forth. So this buck had heard the rattling, came in toward the edge, and he started ripping this tree up. So now I got my release on, and I'm just shaking, like in my head, it's like 200-inch buck, but I'm just waiting and waiting and waiting. And I never made another call. Maybe I should have grunted or pawed the ground a little bit to get him to come closer. But eventually I just heard him kind of walk back into the thicker stuff. And then when I stood up, man, the tree he was rubbing, I could see it. I was like, oh my God, it probably was a huge one. So the rattling definitely can work. And I've seen I think a lot of your videos, when you're tracking, when you're actually like following along, you're using the grunt call a lot. Yeah. Do you have any experiences or stories you can share about like how the noise you're making in the woods and then kind of playing it off like it's a buck, like traveling along, has maybe helped or aided or got the curiosity of another deer?
Oh yeah. So I got to learn about vocalization. I spent a few seasons up in Ontario. So back before I had kids, I was hunting quite a bit. One year I hunted over 50 times, right? That's some mornings, some afternoons. But that's a lot. That's a lot of hunting, 50 hunts in a season. And some of that was up in Ontario where the deer population was higher, and the deer tend to be a little bit more vocal, right? The does are bleating to communicate. The bucks seem to be really responsive to calling, whether it's rattling or grunting. And so I got to use the grunt call a bit more, got some confidence in it, because when I'm in the woods here, I do a lot of grunting and nothing happens. So like a lot, but every now and then it does happen, and it works fantastic. And a few bucks I've shot are either grunting or came into the grunt call. And so what I kind of think is happening, you're in the woods and the population of deer is somewhat low. There's not people pressure, right? If we're talking about pressure prairie that's not very pressured. And so they hear something crunching, whether it's on snow or the leaves, and they're thinking, okay, could it be a moose? Could be a bear, right? Could be another deer. If it's a buck, it could be a doe coming, could be another buck. And if the wind is right, then you hit them with a grunt call, and all of a sudden they now know what you are, right? And that's when, even if I've walked, and this has happened before, I was looking at the map and I was going to a spot in New Hampshire I hadn't been, but there was snow there, and I said, all right, I'm going to go back to near this little pond. Like, doesn't even have a name, just a little tiny pond, right? And it was like a mile walk, and it was a nasty walk. I remember thinking, I hope when I get back there, it's not the same kind of terrain, because it had been logged and it was just this thick stuff. Anyways, I'm almost there. I cut this big buck track in the snow, and it was really fresh, and it was kind of a swamp area, right? Dark timber. So I got out the grunt call, I hit the grunt call, and nothing happened. I probably waited there 5 minutes, not long enough. I walked ahead in the snow. And what I didn't realize had happened is that buck heard me coming. He was bedded only about 50 yards away from where I cut his track. And he got up and he ran off. Then he stopped. He heard the grunt call. He walked back. And I then took a few steps forward, and he must have seen me. I never saw him, and he took off. Then I went and chased him, which was educational. I got to find out where a bunch of signpost rubs were and everything. But that just goes to show it was a little too close for comfort for him. So he got up and he distanced himself. Then he listened. He heard it was a grunt call. He started coming back. And had I waited there a little longer, I think he would have just come right into view and I shot him. So that's kind of what I think is happening. I try not to expose my body, right? And I'm trying not to grunt downwind either, because there's no sense in waiting there for 5-10 minutes if you're grunting downwind, because they're going to know what you are.
I think there's two awesome takeaways from that story. And number one, so many times people talk about bumping a buck, or whether it's out of his bed or, he's already on his feet. Like you trackers, you bump the buck a lot. Like, you get a little too close, make too much noise. But like here in the Midwest, we talk like we're stalking into a stand, trying to get to our spot. You bump a buck up. If the wind is in your favor, a lot of times I think those deer are doing exactly what your story illustrated. They're just playing a little distance. They hear something. They might not know what the hell it is. They're going to run 20, 40, 50, 60 yards, stop and turn around and use all their senses to try to figure out what that was. And if you can calm them with some sort of noise, a grunt, the hunting public guys bring turkey calls, like mouth calls, couple putts on the turkey call if you got turkeys in the area, and that might be enough to just calm that deer down. Whether you're going to be able to get a shot right then, or maybe just let that deer naturally do what it does and have an opportunity later. Like that's a huge thing to realize, that just because a deer busts doesn't mean it knows what you are, especially depending on terrain. Like you were in thick terrain. You got 50 yards from that deer before it took off, and it still probably didn't see you, like you said, until maybe it heard the grunts, came back, and then saw you. So I think that's a huge takeaway that people can learn from, is like, just because you bust something doesn't mean it's over. Like get ready. And then the patience part, which is something we've touched on with the rattling. Like I'm really impatient turkey hunting, but man, time after time after time, if I would have just sat my butt down for 30 more minutes, it would have been game over. So the patience thing is huge no matter what you do, right? Like that's a great story. Illustrated two really good points there. I really like that one.
And I don't know all the deer behavior, but I did want to mention, like, one of the things that I tried to do was read. So I wanted to be a better hunter. I wanted to be a more successful hunter. And I kind of gauged that when I was younger as somebody who could harvest a buck every year. And I grabbed a binder here to show you, like, this is a bunch of articles that I cut out of all kinds of magazines, right? Things that
That's a massive binder, Jeff. Yeah. I love it.
Yeah, and it's all organized, and this is before I had kids. I had this kind of time, but I read a ton to learn more about deer behavior, to learn more about the woods, different techniques, whether it's stand hunting or Midwest or late season or early season, about what they like to eat. So that kind of upped my knowledge, right, and gave me a better ability to understand deer behavior. And then there's actually a great book by John Ozaga, I think I'm saying that right, and he studied deer in Michigan, like big penned deer. He was a researcher, all kinds of information about just deer behavior. And I think that's really helped pay off, because when you're tracking and you're following a buck and maybe it runs into another buck or a doe, things can kind of get confusing, and you're trying to read the sign of what happened, and also try to understand what it's doing, whether he wants to bed or feed or go this way. And all that, somehow putting all that together, right? Being physically fit, being able to shoot, knowing you're, maybe having the right gear if it's nasty conditions out, and knowing which technique to pull out of your tool chest, are all things that eventually add up to being successful. So that's it. There's no one particular thing for me, but all that kind of piled together has helped in the recent years, allow me to consistently harvest some big bucks.
I'm so glad that you mentioned all of the things you just mentioned, because you mentioned in the beginning of the show that you felt like you've been lucky, which maybe getting a kill on camera, maybe that's lucky, because that's hard as hell to do, like especially doing what you do, but killing really good bucks in hard areas to kill bucks. Yes, you can definitely be lucky, but I think you just illustrated that it was your desire to learn more about what you were doing. And for anyone who doesn't know much about tracking and how that whole process works, I really, really think that you should check that out. Like I said, it's something I've never really done, but I have read so many books, watched so many films about it, because it's just another way that I think I can better what I do. And like that desire to learn and be open-minded and have that growth mindset is what sets you apart from other people. And having that idea of that, deer behavior. So when you go into what trackers refer to as a barnyard, so imagine you're tracking a buck. For the listeners here, you're tracking a buck, and when it's one track, it's easy. And like
Oh yeah,
season
that's a dream.
season trackers, season trackers can tell when that buck starts feeding here or there and taking a little bit less direct path. Well, that deer is going to bed pretty soon. Like that's learning deer behavior. But when those deer go into areas that have multiple sets of tracks, especially bucks chasing does, like you really got to understand and try to decipher. Like you got a picture in your mind. That has got to be a hell of a process to try to sort out what and where and how did this deer move through here to try to get back on the deer without killing 2 hours of time to put you 2 hours behind where you thought you were on them. Like it's a little bit of luck, but what you just illustrated with your binder there is it's a lot about your desire and willingness to do what you haven't done and to put yourself in unfamiliar places to learn as much as you can.
Yeah, and some people have the luxury of being able to scout a lot, but hunting the mountains and tracking isn't a technique that really is conducive to scouting, because the deer are going to be where they're going to be, the buck's going to be where he is on that day. So it's more about kind of condensing everything into that one single day as a hunt. Now, if you do track one to the end of the day, you can always go back the next day and hop on the track. I've done that once, but it's pretty much a one-day hunt when it comes to tracking. So there was a story I was going to tell you about the barnyard. So this is going back quite a few years, but it was on a Friday. I took the day off of work and I went up to spot. Like I wanted to be a good tracker so bad. I wanted to excel at it. Right. I went in the woods like 200 yards and I caught a nice big buck track. I followed him maybe 100 yards and he jumped off and took off running, right? So I just caught little glimpses of him. This is literally what I could have shot that buck and been back to the truck in 10 minutes. Like so easy. So he ends up taking off and he runs up the mountain and he goes up and they do this kind of like J hook where they'll loop this way and then bed. So he can look down and then he of course sees me coming. This is an hour later, sees me coming, he takes off.
They're like watching their backtrack a little bit. They like got the advantage and they're like watching what was following them.
Yeah, they're winding up and then they'll go out around and come around like this so they can see you coming. You know what I mean?
They know what they're doing.
Yeah. So he does that and then he goes up on top where it happened to be really thick. I go up on top. I'm making my way. And then I realize he's going into this thick mess. There's no way I'm going to get through there quiet. So I said, you know what? I'll just bump him. He's going to go down off the mountain again. So I went in, bumped him. I heard him take off, grabbed a sandwich. And then when you're tracking, if you're going downhill, there's a big advantage, I feel like, visually, right? Because the deer is walking away from you, right? And he would have to look and then look up at you versus if he's above you, it's easier to just kind of look down. So I always feel like that's an advantage when I'm following one downhill. If I can, I try to catch him that way. So now I'm feeling really good. All right, I got his advantage. And he's gone from a walk to a trot. Or from a run to a trot and to a walk. And eventually I look ahead and there's a guy standing there and I see these big bones sticking out of the snow. And then it dawns on me that about 30 minutes before I heard a shot. and I walked up there and my tracks led right to this buck. And this guy ended up, he was happy as could be. And
was he sitting on a stand somewhere? Or?
He was taking a leak and he looked over and this buck came walking right towards him. So I was happy for him. I was like, what are you going to do? So I took a picture with it. I happen to know the guy and he asked me if I wanted to, because he was coming in from a different road. It was quite a ways from where I had left the car. And he said, oh, I can give you a ride back. I said, no, I'm going to hunt my way back. So I hunted my way back. I didn't see anything. But then 2 days later on Sunday, I was up in another spot, still had my tag, right? So I hunted Saturday and then I hunted Sunday and I had good snow and I caught a nice buck track. It was towards probably like 1-2 o'clock. It was getting later in the day. And he was chasing all over the place, right? He'd been here and there. Every place you went, his track was there and it's hard to tell it was fresh. So I ended up making this huge circle And this is like a pretty well-known technique, right? Make a huge circle. And I ended up cutting his track going out and up the mountain. And so I went back up the mountain. I had just come down, went up there and the backside, and it was pretty socked in with snow up there. You know, the snow was kind of hung. It's like like winter wonderland. And I was just creeping along this finger, following his tracks. I remember he took a shit, and there was some, you know, his turds were there, and I'm looking down at him, and all of a sudden I hear a noise, and I look up, and there he goes. He's got a big rack. He's just jumped out of his bed, and he's running away from me. And I should have known, right? Because he probably was feeding, and then after he was feeding, he probably took a shit, and then from there he went and bedded. So I wasn't paying attention to all the signs, but I did pull up, and I got a shot off, and I clean missed because I ended up tracking him right to dark essentially that night. So afterwards, I ended up having a conversation with this guy, Joe Donito, really well-known tracker from Central New York, legend. And he gave me a lot of confidence by telling me, after I told him what had happened, right? He's like, well, you're a tracker. You got it. You just got to keep doing it. You're not going to always get them. You might get 1 out of 10 that you track. So you got it. That gave me a big boost of confidence that then I was able to kind of, you know, carry on and continue to just use those and pay a lot more attention. When it comes now to a deer going into a barnyard, although at the end of the day, when I close my eyes, I see tracks. I cannot, after tracking all day, it literally.
That's all you see.
Yeah, you close your eyes and all you see are tracks for me. But I pay less attention to the track. It's more about just like the stride and how they're sweeping their feet. And there's all these other things that when I look at a track, it's not the hoof print. It's the whole track, several series of them together that a lot of times you can just follow that. And there's something about it, right? When you kind of envision that's going to you can be like, yep, that's the one. It's right there. It went that way without looking at the hoof print.
I would imagine when you followed one, I would imagine it takes a little ways under your belt following that deer. Like just like you said, it's the whole picture rather than like when you think about a track as just one print. But you just get to learn how that deer walks, how that deer moves through the terrain, and like if you got on the wrong track, I think if you were intuitive and you paid attention to the details, I think you'd probably be able to realize within 100 or 200 yards, like, hey, this deer's doing something totally different. It's just everything feels different if you were really paying attention. What I can see is like a lot of guys, like maybe new guys, like if I was to do it, it would be like, oh yeah, I'll just keep going. But I think once you're in tune with it, I could totally see what you're saying. It's the whole picture of how that deer moves through. Now it seems like, and maybe you don't have a story for this, and that's no problem. You can just talk maybe generalizations, but you kind of mentioned, you know, the big circle around the J where these deer, have you learned a little bit about like where in your terrain the mature bucks tend to like to be when they're bedded or when they're cruising for does? Like, does it make it like on the mountain? The mountain is such a huge expanse, whereas like we're dealing with a couple 100-foot hills here. You have thousands of feet there, but have you seen any like common occurrences that have kind of tipped you off? Like if it's a fresh snow, I'm going to go look here because it's November 10th and this is the area or the type of terrain I think they would cruise through. Have you kind of picked up any of those nuances through your time tracking?
So the biggest fear I have on a good, like perfect snow day is, am I going to find a track early enough? That is the tracker's biggest fear.
You feel like you're like racing the clock the whole time to find one?
Yeah. And everyone asks the question, like, where are you going to find him? And you're going to find the track where that buck has been. That's all there is to it. So I do like to leave, like the perfect scenario would be it stops snowing at about maybe 8, 10, 11 o'clock, something like that at night, right? So no one else has been in the woods. And now you've got maybe 10 hours for the deer to go. And when I say stop snowing, I don't mean like a big, heavy snowstorm. A heavy snowstorm, you probably want to give it longer. But if we're talking about you get like a few inches of snow, now the deer have got time to go lay down tracks. So we're going to leave that. And I can catch up to maybe November 10th. I'd have trouble catching up to one. But
because they're moving?
Yes. But, you know, 5 days on either side of that, you're going to catch that buck. You're going to be able to go catch up to it. So being able to go wherever they've been. And I just I try not to, go to the top of the mountain and then back down, right? I'll just start on fingers and work my way down in drainage, and then maybe hunt, and then kind of hunt up and say, all right, I'm going to hopefully intersect something that maybe has been running the ridge, so you can start to move up. And before you know it, you're into deer tracks, and the deer tracks will lead you to other deer tracks, and you make a choice. Oh, this one's going the wrong way. I'm going to keep going this way. Oh, there's a doe. Let me follow that for a ways. And you're kind of, at least for me, I'm just out there exploring, and then eventually you end up hitting the buck track. And I will tell you, I still feel lucky, and it is a bit of luck, but there is a bit of strategy to the buck I got this past year. So the perfect tracking day, I won't tell you all about the video, but I'm very, very proud of it. It's the best one I've made.
I'm really excited to see it.
People are going to love it. The feedback I got from Hunt Stock, people loved it. And it was really, I think people really enjoy the hunt and everything that goes with the film. But that deer, so we cut a really big buck track from the road, and that's a great way to pick it up because you got one right early, but it was old. And that buck had been all over the place in the past 12 hours. I mean, literally every place you went, his track was going this way. It was really hard to tell. I mean, I can age a track. You can look at the details of the track, and the forest is always dropping litter. And so you can tell, what is older or fresher. But in this case, 6 hours old versus 8 hours old, there's no way to tell the difference between those, So we messed around. My father was with me. We messed around following this track all over the place, and we probably spent about 2.5 hours. We had to be home at 3:00 for dinner. First, it was Thanksgiving Day. So
of course.
And we'd never been to these woods before. There was snow further up north, so we chased snow, kind of following the technique I already mentioned, right? There's a big buck on every mountain. Go find one on that mountain. And we said, it's getting pretty warm. The wind's starting to pick up a little bit. We got to stop messing around. Let's just go find a fresh buck track. And so we picked a vector, and we just headed in that direction. We got all the way out to where it was going to drop down or lose a lot of elevation. And this is where I don't think it was luck. It's based on my experience that I said, I don't want to hook back yet. I want to drop down and see if there's been a buck that's walking along this drainage. There's a river down there. I said, it's kind of a natural boundary. Sure, they can cross that, right? I could cross that too, but there's something about it that just, from a topography standpoint, it seemed like a natural runway that they might use. I'd never been there before. So we started to drop down, and there's the main drainage, and then there's another drainage where this mountain we're coming off of kind of comes in with another one. And we dropped down into that, and I'm probably 3/4 the way to where I can get before I got to turn around. And there is this big smoking fresh buck track right there in the snow. But it hasn't warmed up down low yet. It's still crunchy as could be, right? Because the sun hasn't got there, and you can hear it on the video. It's crunchy. So I call my father over, and I say, look at this track. And I might have used some more colorful language, right? Look at this track. And he goes, yeah. And as he does, we're both happen to be stopped, which is lucky. And out of the corner of my eye, I catch this big buck just coming right back at us.
He heard you crunching?
It was just luck. It was just luck.
Oh my God.
So many times I've been on a track, and he'll like double back a little bit and then go this way, or he'll swing back across this track. And I'm always like, why couldn't I have been here a few minutes earlier? Well, this was the time. I was in the right place at the right time. Here he comes right back, and the camera's already rolling. So I got the whole thing.
Wow.
And I just let him come all the way until he's wide open in the kind of, Adirondacks. There isn't a lot. It's a mature forest, so you can see a long ways in the snow. And I let him have it, and it's awesome. And that was my biggest Adirondack buck. So definitely a little lucky, but also making the choice to drop down and try to check that spot out.
Congratulations, first off, because that's just a memory with that's just so cool. And good job for playing your cards right. I'm just curious as far as layout. So when you got down, how, like, were you close to that creek bottom, that drainage,
Yeah,
or were you like,
we were
was
probably,
the,
I could almost see it. I'd say 150 yards from it. So
now does it stay pretty open, like the hardwoods? Does it stay pretty open down? Like, does it turn into boulders then creek, or do you get more like softwoods along the creek? Like, is it a little bit thicker or
it
still
was
pretty
kind
open?
it was more grassy and open.
Oh,
So
really?
yeah, the forest kind of terminates, and you probably had a swath that was a bit open, right, with some grass, and you have the river. And I didn't go down. I was taking care of gutting him and everything. My father went down and checked his track, see what he had actually done, and he had just walked down, hit the river, walked like 50 yards this way, turned around, and then he was coming right back up. So,
Wow.
and he was motoring, right. He was doing the same thing we had, and I think it's the same buck that we were tracking earlier, because he was just out seeking for hot doe at that point. So, it's Thanksgiving. They're supposed to be slowing down. That's what we always
Yeah.
say. He was still just out there looking for another doe to breed.
You hear that across the country though, that a lot of times those bigger, older, mature deer, like they know that even though it's like tapered off, they know that there's still hot does out there because they played this game before. And sometimes those are the ones that's like when they're most vulnerable. I've talked to a couple guys who say like late November, Thanksgiving week, like that's when the biggest ones are out doing stupid things because they know there's still some little lady out there who's looking for them. Man,
Oh,
talk about timing though. That's incredible, man. That's super cool, Jeff. I'm glad you shared that story. Can't wait to see the video.
and it was really cool to do it with my dad. And
Oh,
we've done a lot of hunting together, but that's actually the first time we've double teamed. Where that's when you're tracking with two people at the same time. So it was just something I wanted to do, and the film goes into that. So to make it happen on the first day, and then we made it home by 3 o'clock for Thanksgiving.
you got him out of the woods by then? That's a
Which
wild.
I ended up leaving him in the woods till the next
Okay.
day, which I've done a number of times. I just put my shirt right on him. Never been a problem, but yeah, it was pretty. It just doesn't happen like that every year.
That's so cool. Oh, that's so cool, man. That's great. That's super interesting. Um, my dad, I mean, anytime you get to experience things like that with close friends or family members, especially, I got to drag my dad into the woods this past fall. He obviously was the guy who led me into the woods on my first few hunts, and he's slowly tapering down on what he can do in the woods. I mean, he's still going, and he's a great hunter. And this last year, I got out and scouted the week before our firearm season opened, and found a pretty fresh clear cut. It wasn't very old, but I just found a tremendous amount of deer sign going out into this clear cut up in the national forest, and I ended up seeing an 8-point buck out in the clear cut, and I didn't see any hunter sign, and I was like, Dad, I don't know what you're planning next weekend, but I'm dragging you with me. Like, I got a spot for us. So we did something a little bit different. We kind of still hunted our way in, and we just waited, and then went up into this clear cut. And I said, well, you take this edge, I'll take this edge, and just still hunt your way, and then just sit and wait. And it wasn't long after daylight, and my dad saw some deer filtering into the cut, and he ended up seeing this buck, and he wasn't going to shoot it because one side was kind of goofy and it just looked small. And he saw the other side, and he's like, "Oh, it looks like a decent 4-point side. What are we out here for? I better shoot." So, boom, he shoots, and I hear Dad shoot, and I got so excited. And buck ended up running way out into the clear cut, and then we finished it off, and spent the whole day hanging out with my dad, dragging his buck out of this hellhole. But it was awesome because it was like he's dragged my deer out my whole, like when I was a kid, and now I got to drag Dad to a spot. He shot one. I got to drag it out for him. Like, it was just, those are the things that, like, no matter what you're dragging, no matter how big that is, it doesn't matter. It's those moments and those memories you make together, and that's one I'll just never forget. I'm glad you got to have one with your dad this fall too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I've come to realize after harvesting a few really big bucks by myself that there is kind of a lonely moment in the woods when, I mean, you're satisfied, right? You had a good hunt, and respect the animal that took their life of, but then you're dragging it out. It's like, it's a whole lot more fun when you got somebody with you, especially somebody meaningful to you, like your father or parent, somebody like that. It's awesome.
Yeah, you end up like looking forward, like when you should be enjoying every second of what you're doing, you end up like looking forward to like when you get back and get to show your dad or your mom, like you're just like thinking about that moment when you get to share it with them. Like it's a cool situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Man, I really have loved what you shared so far. Do you have anything else that you think would be valuable or for our viewers? Otherwise, I mean, we're just about an hour here, so I'm totally cool wrapping up unless you had any kind of thing that you wanted to mention last case, or even a little bit about your film or where people can find you is fine too.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people have ended up seeing my channel at one point or another, but there's a bunch of hunts on there. You said I kind of pioneered the over the shoulder view. I see a lot of people doing that now. I see that and I'm like, hey, good for them. Everybody's doing it.
You were the first I've ever seen.
It's a fantastic view because you can talk to the camera, and you got a great view of what you're shooting. Folks will probably know too that if you're using a GoPro, it's wide angle, so those bucks are pretty close, a lot closer than they look actually on the wide angle camera. But I'd appreciate if anybody hadn't, go subscribe to Tracking. It's actually Jeff Doyle on YouTube, but the series is called Tracking 200, which I should explain too, because the goal of it was to try to show my evolution and process to eventually shoot a 200-pounder, which is the benchmark out here. Mm-hmm. And I've gotten really sidetracked by bucks who there were big racks on them, so I filmed my tag on those, and I still haven't shot one that's over 200 pounds. At least here in the U.S. I have up in Canada, but maybe I don't mind if I don't shoot one. This could be the year. There's a great acorn crop. I'm sure there's a number of big bucks out there over 200 at the moment. I've gotten pretty close, but it's the trying part where the fun is. So that's what Tracking 200 is, and maybe if I get one, it'll become still Tracking 200 because it doesn't matter for me. I get one of these. I'm very thankful. I'm not greedy. I don't have to go kill, $5 in a year, but I do love getting back out there. And just because you get a good one, it doesn't quench the fire in me. At least I want to go back out and just experience it. And sometimes letting ones walk is a really powerful moment too, because I don't get to see deer a lot. That's one thing I miss, right? Tracking them, you get to live in their shoes, you get to experience their behavior, but the amount of deer I see in a season is pretty low, like probably 10 deer.
I would imagine. Yeah, I would imagine. I mean, when you're doing that, you're not really doing it to like view deer, right? Like the idea is you get on the deer you ideally want to kill, and then you just walk up to it and it's over.
Yeah,
if all goes well.
The first second you see it, you're going to shoot it, right? That's it.
That's about what you have, is about 1 second, maybe a little bit less.
Yeah.
I think that the whole idea is so cool, and the tracking, like letting the deer lead you through their woods, is just a different way of seeing the terrain too. I think a lot of times when we talk whitetail tactics, and there's so many podcasts that, tactics this, you hunt this, and upper third and leeward, like, which is all great stuff, but so much of it becomes about like what we're doing and what we're thinking, where the tracking is you're just following what they do and like learning what they do. And that's just it's almost like a purist thing for me. I just think that's so interesting. And you end up looking at the woods probably a lot different than you did before you started the track.
Oh yeah. And you find, I found or had them lead me to so many things I didn't know existed. I spent a lot of time looking at onyx when I'm trying to pick out the next mountain where I think there's a buck, right? Mm-hmm. But you got to put boots on the ground to find out where that little old beaver dam is where they cross, right? Or there's this, weird little area that I called the boneyard because it just has these big buck rubs, and they're big signpost rubs that the deer hit. Not every year, but they kind of bounce between them. And I could have never looked at a map and said, that's a spot where I'm going to go find some big rubs. ever. I can't give any more details on that, but it just it surprised me. And the only reason I found it is because I was tracking a buck and he took me right through there. He didn't hit any of them, but he walked through. I was like, oh my God, look at these rubs. So it's really neat to kind of spend the day in their shoes and see what they see and have them take you through the woods that they know so well. And when you get on a good one, like a real good one, it's pretty neat. One thing I love seeing is where there's like a downed log and maybe a doe or another deer will have walked and hopped over it. And this buck, he just walks around it, right? they're so like not lazy, but they pick the woods apart too. Like I could be all day following a buck track, right? And I feel like it's effortless walking through the woods. If I don't catch them, I have to walk back to the truck. Then I'm like knocking stuff out of my way, stepping over stuff, getting into blowdowns. I'm like, man, where's that buck track? Because he knows how to pick these woods apart. Like
They're
amazing.
good at conserving energy.
They are. It's fun. You got me all pumped up now, and I want it to snow so I can get out there and track again.
We got a little ways to wait for that, don't we?
Yeah.
When are you? I don't know a whole lot about like when your the perfect tracking day. When that video, when is that coming out, or when are we able to see that? What is the plan for that?
Probably maybe October time period. I did a moose hunt in Newfoundland, so I got to get that video out. And there's a few things that happen chronologically that go into that film. My father also shot. I set him up with a backpack camera. He shot a nice buck in the Adirondacks with that. So I want to get that
amazing.
Out. Yeah, it is. It's really awesome. He got it on camera and everything. So there's a few other videos that are coming out, and then I'll release the film. So
yeah, no pressure. I want to see it, but no pressure. You got to do what you got to do.
Yeah.
Well, I'll be excited.
It'd be great if people can keep an eye out for it, and I'll probably do a premiere. So if you're subscribed, you get the notification of it, and I'm looking forward to hearing what people have to say and what they think about it.
Yeah, that's awesome. So anybody who's listening, like we said, if you haven't already, it's Jeff Doyle on YouTube. Is that correct?
Yes.
Jeff Doyle is the channel name, and then Jeff's got you. I mean, you've got some like gear stuff. You got some old like shed hunting story stuff, and like you got some videos back in the archive. I've seen them all. But Tracking 200, really nice, well produced series. Check it out for sure. And then definitely check out this new one, the one that Jeff alluded to in the podcast tonight. Sounds like it's an amazing one. Great moment with Dad. And I can't wait to see your dad's hunt now too. That'll be really fun to watch, hearing a little backstory.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on. It's a great series. I think we can always, as you said, be like a lifelong learner, right? Learner mindset, being able to hear people's stories and get some more info. Going to give us that edge for this season. So thanks for putting this on.
Heck yeah, man. I really appreciate you sitting down and talking with me tonight, Jeff, and we'll have to stay in touch about this season. Congrats on all the success at Huntstock and doing the seminars and stuff. I think it's all great. People should definitely check out your stuff and follow you on all the different social medias. Go check out the YouTube and give the man a subscribe. Let that hard work work for him a little bit too. So thanks a lot, Jeff. I really appreciate you sitting down tonight, and best of luck this season, buddy.
Thanks, Derek. Take care.